Okay, before starting the speech, I should just point out that I'm going to speak about countries that don't exist, and I'm going to mention one word which you might need to think about in your own language is squatters, which in Spanish is ocupas, although that's not really helpful to anyone here. Um, and so you can maybe think of how to say squatters in your own language. Okay, so here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, I should start this speech by saying that I am from a country that does not exist. The second thing I can say is that if any of you have gone abroad recently, then you have definitely passed through a country that does not exist. Okay? So in the first case, I'm talking about England. I was born in England, I grew up in England, but England is actually maybe not really even a country. If you are to ask me the country that I'm from, as in the country that is officially recognized by the United Nations, by the European Union, by all other main international organizations, then I would have to tell you I'm from the United Kingdom, of course. But if you ask someone from England, if you walk around the streets of London or any other big city in England and you say to someone, which country are you from? Then I think it's more likely that they will tell you that they're from England than from the United Kingdom or the UK. And they're very justified in saying that because we do, in normal speak, in politics, in whatever discussions come up in the UK, we often would speak about England as if it's a country. And we have our own flag, of course, the St. George's Cross, the white background with the red cross on. We have our own football team. You can watch England playing rugby, and you can watch England playing all other types of sports. We also have very clearly defined borders. To the north, we have Scotland, which we consider another country, even though Scotland, as we all know, since the referendum, is not a country and wasn't actually a country beforehand. So the Scots call themselves a country, as do we, and the Welsh call themselves a country as well. All of these so-called countries have clear cultural identities. They have a long history of being a country, and England for some time was a nation state with a king, etc. But no seat at any of the big international organizations. And if you look us up on an atlas, then it will probably not appear as England wouldn't appear as a country, but rather as part of the United Kingdom. So now I'm going to speak to you about other countries that don't exist. I'm going to mention to you all manner of crazy and funky names, such as Atlantium, Christiania, and Helgoland, Vergaland. So these are all actual real places, I can assure you. And the people who live in these places are fervently patriotic. They believe in the existence of their country, even though nobody else seems to. And it turns out that there are these regions that call themselves country all over the world. And they do have the trappings of a real country. They have a fixed population, many of them. In most cases, they have a government, and almost all of them have a flag, and most have their own currency as well. And some of them can even issue you with a passport, although it might not be recognized if you try and travel. For one reason or another, however, these countries do not have representatives at the United Nations, and they are not taken into consideration on any world maps. There is even a book on this issue. The book is called An Atlas of Countries That Don't Exist. So there you can find all manner of maps and interesting information about these countries. If you flick through the pages of this book, then you'll find that it feels like you've entered a parallel world with a vibrant, forgotten history and a rich culture. you could then maybe travel around all of these countries and see what it's like to be in a place that is not recognized by other countries. And there is actually a football league, an international football league for all of these countries that don't even exist. So what's the problem? Why is it that these countries cannot be countries? Well, the main issue is that there is no watertight definition of what a country really is. There is a treaty which was signed in 1933. This document was signed during the International Conference of American States, which was held in Montevideo in Uruguay. And this convention states that in order for a region to call itself a country, it needs the following features. It needs a defined territory, a permanent population, and a government, as well as the capacity to enter into relations with other states. So we could say that there are, according to this definition, there are many, many more countries than we may have thought, many more countries than those that have a seat at the United Nations. And then we could think of one example, one well-known example, which is Taiwan. Taiwan held a seat at the UN General Assembly until 1971. It was in this year that mainland China entered and took over the country. Mainland China entered and took over its position at the UN. So Taiwan is one example, and there are many others. There are others such as Tibet, Greenland, and Northern Cyprus. Then I could go on listing all of the less famous ones, some of the names that I mentioned earlier. But these less famous ones are by no means less serious. The book that I mentioned discusses many examples of indigenous populations who hope to reassert their sovereignty by creating a country for their people. One of the most troubling of the histories in this area, one of the most troubling stories that we could consider is the Republic of Lakota. Lakota is right in the center of the United States of America. It's just east of the Rocky Mountains, and it has a population of 100,000 people. This is its people claim that it is a republic, and the aim of the people is to reclaim the sacred Black Hills that once belonged to the Sioux tribe. Sioux spelt S-I-O-U-X. I'd love to tell you their story, but I don't think I have much time. I can just summarize it in saying that there was a deal signed which acknowledged the rights of the indigenous Indians to own the Black Hills. This deal was signed in 1868, but then a gold rush happened, and prospectors who were looking for gold swarmed in, and they threw the original inhabitants off the land, and they lost their rights to it. There are similar battles taking place all over the world and on almost every continent. For example, there's Barotseland, an African kingdom with a population of 3.5 million that has mounted a case to leave Zambia, to separate and become its own independent nation. And then, of course, we have Ogoniland, which is attempting to separate from Nigeria. Then in Australia, we have the Republic of Murawari, which was founded in 2013, just quite recently. And this was the country was founded after the indigenous tribe inhabiting the area wrote a letter to Queen Elizabeth II in England, another non-country. And they asked the Queen to prove her legitimacy to govern their land. They wanted her to be the official ruler of their newly founded country. Sadly, Elizabeth II didn't reply to their letter, and this meant that the country has not really taken many steps towards official recognition around the world. Now, so these are quite serious attempts at creating a country. People who really feel that they deserve a country for their people for one reason or another. But the book that I mentioned also features examples of countries which are really just created by eccentric individuals, people who are a bit loony and decide that they want to create a country for whatever reason. There is, for example, the Hutt River in Australia. This is a small principality that has been set up, which maybe when it was created aspired to be a country. It was set up by a family of farmers for the sole reason of wanting to avoid paying quotas, avoid paying taxes on their grain, on the crops that they harvested. They soon created their own royal titles, setting up their own monarchy. They set up their own currency and even their own postal service. Then in Europe you can find Fauvik. This is a tiny island in the Shetlands, to the north of the British Isles, and it was founded by an Englishman from Kent who wants to promote transparent governance. So that's more of a noble aim, I feel. Sounds like a good initiative. Maybe we can go and visit one day. Then you've also got Sealand, which is off the British coast as well. Then you've got Christiania. Christiania is an enclave within Copenhagen, within the city of Copenhagen. Christiania was formed by a group of squatters who were occupying a former army barracks in 1971. They declared their barracks independent from the rest of the country, and they claimed that they were running their own direct democracy. Each of the inhabitants could vote on any important matter, but there were only 850 inhabitants in total. In Christiania, it is legal to smoke cannabis, despite the fact that it is illegal in the rest of Denmark. But the Christianians, as they call themselves, have decided to ban harder drugs, so only cannabis seems to be allowed. Despite these more eccentric examples, the author of the book that I mentioned, his name is Middleton, wouldn't consider trying to set up a country himself. He says that creating a country entails a whole lot of yearning, oppression, administrative battles, a great deal of fighting against the tide in order to set up your own country. And it's not really something that should be taken lightheartedly, he says. Ultimately, only a small number of these countries that I've mentioned will ever actually gain wider recognition. But the author believes that there's one country which may well gain official recognition at some point in the coming years. This is Greenland. Greenland is an autonomous region of Denmark, of course. It already has its own self-rule, and self-rule is often considered to be the first step towards formal recognition. So maybe one day soon Greenland will have its own seat at the UN. So given the difficulties in defining what a country actually is, there seem to be many differences on how a country should be defined. Maybe we should start rethinking what a nation state actually is. Maybe we should somehow overhaul the whole system and maybe do away with countries altogether. After all, there's the example of Antarctica, which is a whole continent which is shared by lots of different governments in a peaceful manner. So maybe a similar system could be set up somehow for other parts of the world. We don't necessarily have to slice up the world as if it were a giant cake or a giant pizza. Now, I've mentioned a few eccentric examples of countries that don't exist, but there is one country which is maybe not so much eccentric, but rather radical, and I quite like this idea. This is the country known as Atlantium. It is in a remote province of Australia which has more kangaroos than people. But this is just where the administrative quarters, the administrative running takes place. Atlantium is actually non-territorial, so that means that it's a country which is not based on having borders. It is based simply on people deciding to become a citizen whenever they like, wherever they like, and anyone can do so. The idea of this country is that it is a way of actually unifying people with common interests. So maybe people believe in a political aim, or they have some kind of aspiration that they all share, and so they can become part of this country which represents their views. And the idea is that we shouldn't assign nationality to people simply on the basis of where they were born, or on the basis of the circumstances surrounding their birth. And then, as I said to you at the beginning of the speech, if you travel abroad, you will have definitely gone through one country that doesn't exist. And I mentioned the name earlier as well. This is Helgoland Vageland. Now, this country is made up of all the areas of no man's land around the world. Okay, so one example we could take is the land between North Korea and South Korea. There's a strip of land which nobody controls, so that, according to the creators of this country, is part of Helgoland Vageland. Then all of the parts of the sea which do not officially belong to any country are also part of Helgoland Vageland. And then any land making up borders between two countries is also Helgoland Vageland. So if you get on a plane, you're flying over, I guess the plane itself is even no man's land because it's not owned by a country, it's not part of a territory. And you're flying over sea, that means you're flying over Helgoland Vageland. So quite an interesting country. It kind of reminds me of the idea of Narnia, that fictional idea. Now, many of these countries may be a bit too fanciful, a bit too far-fetched for most of us to take seriously, but they all raise the possibility that countries, as we know them today, are not really the legitimate basis for ordering the planet. And the world, after all, is constantly changing. The Soviet Union fell apart a few decades ago, and a few years previously, no one would have expected that to happen. So maybe we'll see big changes taking place in our lifetimes. Maybe someday we might even see the end of nation states. People could maybe be united under one fair, truly democratic system of government. We could maybe aspire to having a world with no discrimination based on the country that you're from or the country that appears on your passport. But yes, this is a very far-off dream. It will probably not happen in my lifetime, I think. But in the meantime, what I could suggest is that maybe those of us here today, we could create our own republic. Maybe IBPG Landia or something like that. Practice group land, or I don't know. And we could, there might be a few administrative difficulties, but I think it's clear who the citizens would be. It would be all of us. And I'm sure in the pub afterwards you'll have lots of good ideas on the principles that can guide our nation. We can come up with ideas for laws, and then of course we will all have to pledge allegiance to our great leader, Federica.
Stop.
Thank you.